Section 14 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Mozart. The most gifted musician the world has ever known, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791, was born in the little Austrian town of Salzburg. No other musician has ever had such combination of genius and learning or so excelled in all kinds of music. When only 3 years old, he enjoyed music and picked out notes on the clavier. When he was 5, he began to compose and play little pieces which his father wrote down. The pieces he wrote when he was 6 are still played by children. They are tuneful and charming. Mozart had a very happy childhood. His father was a good musician who devoted himself to teaching his 2 children, a girl, Marianne, and the boy, Wolfgang. As well as this, he was a court musician to Archbishop Sigismund, the ruler of Salzburg. When Wolfgang was 7, his father began to take him on journeys to various important towns to show off his and his sister's wonderful powers. They went to Munich, Vienna, and Paris, and England, and everywhere had great success. The little Mozart played the most difficult pieces for the clavier and violin, and he also played the organ. He was only 12 years old when he wrote an Italian opera, La Finta Giardiniera, which is still sometimes performed and has real beauty. His powers were considered so marvelous that he was often given special tests. Once he was shut up for a week in a room with the words of an opera and the means of writing to see if he really wrote alone and understood the technique of writing for orchestra and voices. He was always successful in these tests, and when his father took him to Italy, it was like a triumphal tour. Wherever he went, people crowded to see him, and a way had to be cleared for him to enter any church where he was going to play the organ. He and his father arrived in Rome on the Wednesday in Holy Week, just in time to go and hear the music in the papal chapel. On Wednesday and Friday of that week, a special work by Allegri was always sung. It was partly in 5 parts, partly in 8, and as it was never sung anywhere else, it was considered a wonderful thing to hear. Mozart was so interested that he performed a marvelous feat of memory. He listened to the 5 and 8-part chorus and then wrote down the music afterwards. And when he heard the work again 2 days later, he corrected the few notes he had not remembered and had a perfect copy of this seldom heard music. No other musician has had quite such a memory for music. In later life, he played all his numerous concertos by heart, and very often, when he composed a work for clavier and other instruments, he did not write down the clavier part, but only the other parts, and played his own without a mistake, though he had never heard it with the other instruments except in his head. At one concert in Vienna, the emperor thought he could see that Mozart only had a blank sheet of paper in front of him when he played a sonata with a violinist. He therefore sent and asked to see this music. Mozart brought him the paper, which was indeed blank, and explained that it was a new composition of his, and that he had only written down the violin part the day before, and had had no time to write the clavier part. It was so all through his life. His mind was so clear about music that he never began to write down a piece, whether for orchestra, instruments, or voices, until it was all quite finished in his head. By that time, he himself knew it so well that the actual labor of writing became irksome, and sometimes when writing out a long orchestral work, he was glad to have amusing conversation round him to relieve the tedium of transcription. No one has ever as he did lived so completely in music. His manuscript books went with him on all his travels, and he was constantly writing. He had not much knowledge of J.S. Bach's music until, on a visit to Leipzig, he heard the pupils at Bach's school, the Thomas Schule, perform one of his cantatas. Mozart was enraptured. "Here is music from which one can learn something," he exclaimed, and he had all the music by Bach which the school possessed brought out for him to see. Now music is usually written with all the parts for voices or instruments one above the other on the same page. This is called full score, and it makes it easy for a musician to see at once what all the instruments and voices are doing at the same time, and so hear the music in his head. But in this case, each part was written on a separate sheet. Mozart, nothing daunted, spread the sheets all round him and enjoyed combining and hearing in his head this wonderful music. By the time Mozart was 21, he was a fully equipped musician. He had written serious and comic operas, a great deal of church music, and though other musicians usually played one instrument and were famous for that alone, Mozart could play clavier, violin, and organ, and compete with the greatest performers of his time. But there was one great misfortune in his life, and that was the lack of music in Salzburg and the difficulty he had in getting away. The prince for whom he and his father worked was the Archbishop Hieronymus, who was hated by the people he governed and disliked by his musicians. Most of the great nobles were proud of the famous musicians whom they employed and glad to encourage them and give them opportunities to produce new works and make for themselves fame and money. But Archbishop Hieronymus not only paid extremely small salaries to his musicians, but he disliked giving them leave of absence, and though he was proud of having good musicians in his service and getting them to write music for special occasions, he never gave the customary salaries without which it was almost impossible to live, and he was constantly making his musicians feel their subordinate position. Michael Haydn, a brother of the famous composer Joseph Haydn, was himself a good composer and in the employment of the Archbishop at Salzburg. Once, when he was ill and unable to finish some compositions, which the Archbishop wanted by a certain date, he was told that if he did not complete them in time, his salary would be stopped. Michael Haydn, in despair, appealed to Mozart, who was all his life generous in money and effort for anyone in need, and Mozart at once wrote the required works for him. The Archbishop was constantly rude to Mozart, and after he had learnt all it was possible for outside things to teach him, and was recognized as a famous composer, the Archbishop told him he was a bad servant and ought to study more. Mozart's father, feeling that his son's future depended on his having a regular position and fixed income, however small, put up with the constant insults and kept out of the Archbishop's way as much as he could, only saying, "The prince does not like old men." But with young Mozart it was different. On his travels he had everywhere been received with courtesy and appreciation. To the end of his life he remained unspoiled by his success, and he was accustomed to be on terms of friendship and equality with the great nobles whose houses he visited and at whose concerts he played. Mozart's father realized that it was impossible for his son to remain in Salzburg. His talents were wasted there. There were no concerts at which to play. No one needed operas composed. There were no other great musicians, and when the Archbishop put too many difficulties in the way of his traveling and gaining commissions to write and a wider view of his art, he realized at last that the only way was for him to resign his post. So young Mozart left Salzburg, accompanied by his mother, and traveled through Munich to Paris. It was not, however, his last unpleasantness with the Archbishop. This prince soon felt that he had made a mistake in losing so good a musician, and offered him a larger salary if only he would return to Salzburg. Against all his inclinations, Mozart at last gave way, and went back to join the Archbishop's suite at Vienna. There he was made to take meals with the valets and cooks, and was not allowed to go and play at other houses and thus acquire money and fame as all other artists did. He was so constantly insulted that he at last again resigned and was kicked out of the house by one of the Archbishop's servants. Mozart now settled in Vienna and lived a very busy life. The Emperor Joseph himself always had his midday meal in his music room and hurried over his food as quickly as possible so that he might have an hour's concert before he went on with the work of the day. Many Hungarian and Austrian noblemen lived in Vienna and had daily or weekly concerts which often lasted several hours. Even the servants in noble houses were sometimes engaged only if they could play a musical instrument as well as perform their domestic duties, and the standard of playing was very high. Noblemen in Vienna, as well as having private orchestras, engaged for their daily concerts any famous musician who came to Vienna, and gave large presents and money to the musicians who thus played for them, besides giving them commissions to compose music to be performed at their concerts. Mozart was in constant request at these concerts. He also gave lessons, and all the time he composed. Sometimes when listening to other people's music, or even when playing a game, his lips would move, humming or whistling the notes he heard in his head, and he would dot down a few notes on a scrap of paper to remind him of what he had been composing. Every morning he wrote music, and in the evening he sat and played far into the night. Played not pieces he had composed, but improvisation, as it is called, just music as it flowed through his mind and out through his fingers. Those who heard it said it was the most beautiful music they had ever heard, and it made an unforgettable impression on them. These improvisations did not only take place at night in Mozart's house, but whenever he gave a concert, he would take a theme or tune, sometimes more than one, and improvise on it to the delight of his audience. Concerts in those days were much longer than those we have now, and people attended day after day with unwearied delight. Much of the music to which they listened was lighter in character than the music we hear at concerts now, for a great deal of the gay spirit that gave pleasure at that time disappeared when composers definitely aimed at expressing depth of feeling. It seems wonderful to us that Mozart could have accomplished the amount of work he did, teaching, playing almost daily at concerts, and for his own performance at these concerts, composing his numerous piano concertos, still some of the most beautiful music that has been written for the piano. He composed clavier sonatas as well for his pupils to play. In those days, many noble ladies were good performers on the clavier, and Mozart gave music lessons to several such ladies, and took trouble to write music for them to perform. He also composed symphonies for his concerts, but his greatest desire always was to write operas. In Vienna, the Emperor Joseph II did not wish to spend much on music, and when he did give Mozart a regular appointment, it was with a very small salary. This obliged Mozart to depend on lessons and concerts to make enough to live. The emperor was, however, interested in the revival of German art, though he himself preferred Italian opera, which he found lightly entertaining, while the depth of meaning and fullness that Gluck, Haydn, and Mozart put into their music overpowered him almost to weariness. However, he wished to encourage German opera and wished to give Mozart an opportunity. The result was that Mozart wrote Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Elopement from the Seraglio. It was what was called a German vaudeville or Singspiel, that is, a comic opera in which much was spoken, with songs and concerted vocal pieces inserted. It had an enormous success, and still has whenever it is performed. The great musician Weber, who himself later wrote such beautiful operas, was very fond of Die Entführung. He felt it was the work in which Mozart became a finished musician. Experience of life taught him to write beautiful operas afterwards, but it was his complete experience of music that enabled him to produce this light and beautiful vaudeville. The work was first produced in July 1782. In August of the same year, Mozart married Constanze Weber. Besides all his music, Mozart found time to enjoy himself. He was not only very happy with his wife, but very fond of congenial society. His wife arranged parties in their house, and many hours were passed with friends in gaiety and merriment. Mozart also loved fine clothes and dressing up, and made many occasions for light-hearted convivial amusements. At this period of his life he made a good deal of money by his concert playing, but composition was never lucrative. A small fee was given for an opera, and the composer received nothing of the large sums which might be made from it later on. So Mozart had very little regular income. But when Frederick William II of Prussia offered him a good salary if he would move to Berlin, the Emperor Joseph appealed to Mozart to remain in Vienna, and Mozart did so, though in constant trouble for money. To us it may seem strange that he should have been anxious and eager to compose operas and should have found so little encouragement. The truth is that Mozart's playing was so inspiring that many people who appreciated and could pay him for that can hardly have realized how supreme his compositions were. It was only understood by the greatest contemporary musicians, such as Joseph Haydn, who constantly tried to get Mozart commissions and appointments, knowing his genius and the beauties that he alone could produce. In Vienna his playing was admired, but his compositions, though successful, were not appreciated as they should have been. Also, Mozart was young, too young, for his life, so full of music and beauty, ended when he was only 35. Other musicians, such as Haydn, were indeed famous by that age, but that compelling fame which brought them money and admiration wherever they went only came in later years. Though Haydn worked for a fairly good salary for Prince Esterhazy, and his works were known and appreciated by other musicians all over Europe, it was not till he was over 60 and had been to England that he was really well off, and in such a commanding position that he was properly paid for all he did and venerated as a great master. Such years never came to Mozart. His life of constant work, full of the joys of music, of friends, and his own unquenchable gaiety, was hampered by daily difficulties. His wife, Constanze, was delicate, and neither of them was very good at managing what money they had, though they lived very simply and spent very little on food. One day a friend came in on a cold day and found them dancing together because they had no money to buy wood to make a fire, and Mozart, whose spirit never failed, proposed dancing in order to keep warm. In 1786, Mozart produced in Vienna his opera Le Nozze di Figaro. It is full of beautiful melody, wonderful in the use of the orchestra, original in the clear realization of the characters, and vivid and fresh. It has an immortal beauty. Its success was immediate, but still Mozart was not released from the necessity of giving lessons and playing to earn money. Some old friends who had seen the difficulties in his way in Vienna, the constant efforts made by other musicians in more assured positions to prevent his operas being too successful, and their constant jealousy of his genius, arranged for Figaro to be given in Prague and for Mozart to be present. The applause was tumultuous. Mozart stayed in the house of a nobleman, Count Thun, and gave concerts which made him a good sum of money, and he entered on a contract to produce another opera for Prague the next year. He then wrote Don Giovanni. This opera has melodies we all know and love. It has always had a special position among artists of all kinds. Not only have musicians felt that it was a perfect opera, but Goethe said that it had fulfilled his greatest feelings of how music could ennoble tragedy. Even now, as we hear it, we feel we meet in Mozart a unique personality who wrote with such clearness of vision that situations and characters which might have been sordid have a light thrown on them by his music that lifts them from the ordinary world of good and bad, makes fresh additions to our knowledge of human character, and expands our powers of sympathy and feeling. Still, Mozart's position did not improve. A year later, the emperor again commissioned an opera, and this time Mozart had to take a story chosen for him, Così fan tutti. The subjects of Figaro and Don Giovanni he had chosen himself, and the words, libretti as they are called, had been written by an artist, d'appoint, with whom he could discuss the works as they proceeded. Mozart's refinement and wealth of music is to be found in this opera as in his others. It creates a world where what is fanciful is so beautiful that we see the ordinary world of reality in a new way. And as we listen to the music, we realize that gaiety of heart is a most vital force and a most far-reaching illumination. It is music that only Mozart could have written, and the opera is still performed with delight to whoever hears it. In spite of his artistic successes, Mozart was now seriously in need of money. His wife was ill, and her ill health was a constant strain on his finances. These cares seemed as if they would affect his power to write. He toured a few German towns to give concerts, and he had to pawn his silver in order to get enough money to set out on his journey. When he returned to Vienna, it was just in time to say goodbye to Papa Haydn before he went to London. It was at this moment that a theatrical manager, Schikaneder, who had a poor theater, a barn rather than a theater, in Vienna, asked Mozart if he would write for him the music of a magic opera, Zauberflöte, the magic flute. As Constance Mozart was away undergoing a cure, Mozart lived in a summer house in the courtyard of the theater while he composed. He was also writing at this time his famous Requiem, which had been commissioned by a mysterious stranger. Mozart himself said that the Requiem was a work which lay very near his heart. He was ill and overdone, and when his wife returned from Baden, he told her he was writing the Requiem for himself. She was much distressed at his condition, and took away the music, and for a time his health improved. It was only for a short time. He became much worse. The long strain of writing the Zauberflöte and the Requiem had been too much for him, and the success of the opera, which seemed at last to promise an easier life, was useless to him. During the last days of his life, offers came from Hungary and Amsterdam of a large settled income in return for the compositions it would have been his joy to produce, but it was too late. For a fortnight he lay, conscious that he was dying, knowing that the end had come to his work, and that he was leaving his wife and 2 children just when he could have made money to support them in greater ease and comfort. On December 5th, 1791, he fell asleep and did not wake again. His wife was completely prostrated. His few friends who took part in the service in church did not go to the graveside, for a storm of snow and sleet was raging. The friend who arranged the funeral, though rich, had not considered what was due to a genius who lives now in the heart of every one who loves music. Mozart was buried in a common grave, and when his wife visited the churchyard, no one could tell her where that grave was. To no other musician has music seemed such a natural language as it was to Mozart. He seemed a being in complete harmony, free from self-consciousness, with a perfect sense of proportion, writing from pure inspiration. He never strove for expression beyond his powers. Sometimes we imagine the piano sonatas and concertos are works for children, but as we grow older, we hear under their simplicity the deep feeling and varied beauty they convey. His operas are the beginning of modern opera, his orchestration the beginning of modern orchestral music, and some of the most beautiful. His lovely quartets, the beautiful music of the Requiem, all these show Mozart's unique powers. And through them all shine a spirit so pure, so uplifted, that to anyone who can enjoy his music, there is opened the door to a realm of beauty whose clearness and lightness are unknown elsewhere. His last opera, The Magic Flute, sums up as it were his unique powers and shows the new beauties he could create. Here we meet characters that are more real to us than people in everyday life. So vivid does his music make them. Here, too, we find the seriousness that underlay all his music. Here, too, are the music passages that can only be represented completely in music, the music of ineffable charm that he wrote for the Magic Flute and the Chime of Bells. It is indeed a magic opera of magic beauty and magic power. It won admiration and affection from Beethoven and Goethe, as from all lovers of music since, and its beauties of sound and spirit are so many they seem inexhaustible. End of section 14 of Music by Ursula Creighton. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 6, 2024.